Hi, welcome to another episode of Luncheonette with Lora Diaz. That's me, and I'm so excited to have you join us for a great episode today. We're going to be talking with Maria Bates about open adoptions, and I know that's a subject that a lot of you have been very interested in. We've had some requests come in, so I'm really excited. But before that, I'd like to share just a few announcements with you. First of all, we have recently posted a video from the Florida State Foster Adoptive Parent Association, and there's actually several workshops and other items we filmed out there, so take a look. You're going to see it under the announcements, the recently posted videos, so I hope you'll enjoy that information for those of you who weren't able to attend them in person. Next, on August 28th through the 30th, we have the Child Protection Summit that's going to be happening in Orlando. So you're going to see on the episode resources a link so you can check out more information and register for that. And last but not least, the Growing Pains 2013 conference is also going to be held about the same time. It's August 27th through the 30th in Orlando. That is the big independent living conference. There's going to be huge workshops and speakers and opportunities for you to learn more information about working with our teenagers in the system, so we hope that a lot of you will be able to join that. So, without further ado, I look forward to introducing to you Maria Bates. Hi, Maria.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us today. So we want to talk to you, Maria, and get your information and just your expertise about open adoption. So can you just introduce yourself and tell our viewers what you do and how you've become such an expert with open adoptions?
Well, I'm an attorney, and 90% of my practice is adoption and fertility, and done lots of work in the foster care system, and probably because when I first started my career I was a counselor and worked with teens in the foster care system with addictions and mental health issues. So it's a big passion of mine, and I've also adopted through the foster care system, and I've adopted privately too. And I'm an adoptive parent of 2 children where we have an open adoption through a private placement.
Okay, fantastic. So you live this personally. Wonderful. So Maria, can you explain to our viewers, the reason that we want to talk and we want our viewers to consider open adoptions and kind of what the legislation says about open adoptions?
Sure. Well, historically, adoptions have been closed. So the idea in history was that these should be completely closed, completely private, and the children should only know this new family as their family, and that was the way it always was. So that system moving forward through our statute shows that we have typically closed adoption. So even though you have a foster parent who's been parenting a child, may have a contact with the biological family of this child, when the biological parents lose their rights are terminated, then the adoption happens, they sever those connections again. And so in some ways this is a double loss and another trauma to children. So we've seen legislation come up not only in Florida but in other states that support open adoption. So Florida actually does have a statute, 63.0427, which talks about continued contact. And it is not just continued contact between the child and biological parents, but it also talks about the breadth of open adoption, which includes potentially siblings and other biological relatives to the child.
Okay, fantastic. And for you out there, we're going to post this statute so you can take a look at what we're talking about right here on our show.
So in my experience, actually, we don't see a lot of formal agreements. So there's not a lot of contracts out there that go and are included in the final adoption judgment. What we do see is informal open adoptions because the foster parents have been open and or willing to maintain contact with the biological family. And sometimes that's because the child has an ongoing relationship with the grandparent or one of the parents who sort of said, I just can't do this, and it's time for me to say I want you to be the parent and to adopt this child. And sometimes it's because there's been a court who said, for this child's best interest, we need to have an open adoption, either with the biological parents, with the biological grandparent or aunt or uncle, or siblings that have been split into 2 different adoptive homes, for example.
Mm-hmm. So what do you see, Maria, as far as open adoption agreements? What is usually typical in those agreements?
Well, there's a couple different ways to handle legalizing the open adoption aspect of that. And one is through an agreement, and one is through really simply the court, finalizing an order that says there must be continued contact. Agreements I see both in the public and private world, which are between adoptive families and birth families typically, really describes if there is openness, what type of openness, how long will that openness last? So we're going to send pictures and letters on such and such, dates every year, and we're going to send it through this online website, or it will say we're going to have visits and contact, once a year, once every 6 months, or whatever that might be, depending upon what the parties have arranged. The court may also specify whether it's supervised or unsupervised visits, and sort of the type of contact. And then there's typically, in an actual agreement versus a court order, just some clarification as to if this breaks down, what do we do? So we may have mediation, we may have some third party that we go to directly to handle this openness. The court certainly will, use mediation as it needs when things break down in the future, and the statute does go over that.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So are you seeing a lot now of the formalized ones where the court is dictating it a little bit more, or do you see more agreements that because of more family engagement, because I think foster care more recently has gotten into, especially with QPI, the family engagement model where foster parents are working together more closely with both relatives and even the other foster parents that might have siblings. So do you see, because of that, more agreements being put together up front?
I don't see very many formalized agreements. No, not yet. I'd like to see that trend happen more, because I think that with any open adoption, you should have something in writing memorializing, whether it's a court order or a simple agreement that says this is what we're planning to do. Open adoption is, in my view, it's kind of like a marriage. This is a lifelong relationship you build. And if at some point it breaks down and you sever this relationship, again, it can be another trauma for our children. Absolutely. So we want to prevent that by being clear about this is the type of contact, this is how we're going to have the contact, this is what will happen if it breaks down. And they do break down. So just like any significant relationship we're in, we don't communicate the same way. I mean, Laura and I, we could sit here and leave this room today and say, I thought this happened. Laura's going to say, I thought this happened, and then it's somewhere in the middle. So when you can memorialize that, everybody can kind of come back and say, this is what the plan is. And I think a lot of times when we're dealing with the foster care world is that you have biological families who have not had healthiest choices. And so the reasons why their rights are terminated is and so the court says protect the best interest of the child. So you may have a biological family who is mental health issues and drug abuse, a chronic homelessness, and a variety of other issues, where an adoptive family or a foster family may be very afraid to maintain continued and open contact with them. So setting boundaries, for example, like, as long as when you are visiting the child, you are not using, we are in a safe place, things like that, to set those clear boundaries will help be clear in the future, sort of what will happen if it ends up breaking down.
Now, why did they change and do a shift? Because I know several years ago, really, more people were against open adoptions, and I understand that there's been some changes and some information and data that's come available that's really showing us that open adoptions are more beneficial to the child. Can you share any of that?
Research and statistics definitely showing that open adoptions are a great avenue for many, many families. It is not for every family, and the first thing you should be doing is assessing your family, your needs as a person, as a parent to this specific child, as a parent to the children in my home, and then through the eyes of your child, what does your child really, really need? They may have long-term relationships, and if you're adopting a 16 or 17-year-old, research definitely shows they often do end up reconnecting with biological family, particularly with the social media like Facebook. This is happening without our decisions as parents. And so these are very, very real, normal things that are occurring. So the legislation really is showing more openness. The big change last year was that it could be court ordered by a judge or the court to say, we will modify this openness, and now it's really back more in the hands of the adoptive family. That's the change in the statute. There's always new possible legislation that indicates we'd like to have more clear rules as to how do you create the agreement, how do you modify the agreement, who has the power to modify the agreement, and so on and so forth. So there's sort of always a conversation between policymakers on different sides of it saying, well, we think this is better and we think this is better.
Right.
But as it is right now, that openness exists. It's per the statute. You can have that agreement. And again, it is still primarily the adoptive parents who can modify that.
Now, if you have an adoption that you did several years ago, would this, and you had maybe an informal, not written open adoption agreement, would this statute pertain to them? Could the biological parent petition the court to enter into a modified open adoption agreement, even though it was never in writing initially?
I have not seen that personally, so I'm going to just say that. And I believe we didn't see a lot of agreements in the past, and so you're going to want to talk to an attorney immediately if this question were to pop up. Typically, when the case closes out adoption, the courts don't often hear those things, and a breach of an open adoption agreement does not put off the adoption. It will not allow the adoption to go backwards. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense.
So I think that really at the time, if that were to come up, you need to talk to an attorney immediately and find out what's happening there.
So would you recommend, let's say I'm a foster parent looking to adopt my foster child, would you recommend, especially in light of the statute and really this trending towards more open adoptions, would you recommend, like in a staffing or in some type of a setting, trying to work out some of the logistics of an open adoption and some agreement before going to court?
Definitely.
Okay. That's what I would
Definitely. I think that there's sort of legal answers, and then there's the parent in me and the person who has experience as a social worker to say, the law, and putting everything in contract form works in a certain way, but everybody being on the same page also is very, very helpful. And you can't always sort of codify, or you can't always put in writing what you really are all agreeing to. I think what's important is, as a prospective adoptive parent, is to get everyone's feedback and view, and then sit back, talk to your child's therapist directly, think it through with your family about how this will look for your family. I've seen incredibly successful open adoptions where you have half siblings who are parented by different families, some by biological relatives, some by adoptive families, and they all stay in contact in some regard. So to actually sit down and write that out may be very complex.
I can see that, especially when they're all around in
different
places.
But everybody having a base understanding of what the intentions are behind the open adoption, formalizing that piece of it or memorializing that piece of it and saying, here's why we're doing this. And then saying, and here's how we're going to do it as a minimum. You can build relationships over time far better than at just a month or two saying, okay, we're going to finalize our adoption now, and we want to write these agreements or have the court, create an order incorporated into the final judgment of adoption. I always see open adoptions as expanding over many, many, many years and building relationships. It's difficult to build a marriage over a few months, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
when I think of open adoptions like a marriage, I think you're going to have to develop that. But your underlying intentions from the beginning is what is key, I think.
Have you seen a situation where they can't come to an agreement and it causes a problem in the adoption? For instance, a biological parent who's sitting out there saying, no, I want a once a month unsupervised visit, and the adoptive parent saying, no, I'm not comfortable with that, and could that create a problem in that adoption going through?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that depends on what is the guardian ad litem's position. It depends upon what the state's position is. Depends on if the biological parent's rights have been terminated or not. If the rights have not been terminated, the biological parents may say, I'm not willing to voluntarily sign the surrender, so we're going to go forward and I'm going to fight for this. You may see other relatives step up and say, no, I want this because this prospective adoptive family is not willing to have an open relationship with us. And sometimes they do break down, but oftentimes when you have a child who's been in your home for a year or 2 years, the bond is there, the attachment is there. These are things that get to be worked out. What I tell my clients when they come to me is that the adoption process itself will make you somewhat neurotic. It's just, and I've lived it. I mean, I went through my own home studies and things like that for my 3 children. And so even I knew everybody in the process, I was very experienced, I had all the knowledge, it was very scary at times. And so when you're shifting from, I'm the foster parent and our goal is reunification, to I am now mom or dad, or mom and dad, or mom and mom, or whatever your family is. There's a big transition that occurs.
Yes,
so you have to start getting comfortable with things that you may not have had to be comfortable with before. Goal is reunification. You will probably be doing visits at some time with the biological family. When you realize that rights are terminated and you are really becoming the full legal parent, sometimes there's an ownership that takes hold of, this is my child and I really, really want to protect, because now they're not telling me I have to do these visits. So you may have a ton of conflicting feelings about how do we do this. So that's where guardian ad litem, therapist, everybody else can help you process that transition, because you just may be afraid of the open adoption at this point, even though you have been doing the visits previously.
Well, I think a lot of times that could come in because when you're working together with the biological parent and they feel that you are really supporting reunification and they think you're kind of in their corner, and then all of a sudden when they realize this isn't going to happen and it's going to turn, all of a sudden they may see you taking a different side, even though you're not. You're just basically saying, well, I love your child and I'm attached and I'm willing to make this commitment to them. Sometimes I think to the biological parent there is that shift, you know what I'm saying? And then they're thinking, oh my gosh, you're not still helping me, you're against me. So there could become that conflict in the relationship, or the change in the relationship.
Absolutely. So, and here's I draw from my experience also in private adoptions where we have infant placements, for example, where we place or match a birth mother who's pregnant or expectant mother who's pregnant with a prospective adoptive family. The expectant parents choose the adoptive family. They choose the adoptive family also on the factors of, would this family continue contact, a semi-open adoption or an open adoption? Will I visit? Will I get pictures and letters and things like that? When you have a child removed into the foster care system, they are not oftentimes choosing you. You may be in the end who they choose and love you, but they are not necessarily choosing you from the beginning, and it feels like to them everything is being taken away.
Right.
So their experience and their willingness to do an open adoption, and sometimes their feelings of entitlement about the level of openness, may be in conflict with how you're feeling about everything, and you may feel a lot of anger about them not doing the work, and you're now the parent who has to explain to your child, they weren't well, they couldn't take care of you,
right.
Those kinds of things. And so it's a very complex and dynamic and ever-changing world, I think. So at the beginning, when you're considering open adoption, you really need to sit down and think about what your intentions are and why you're doing it.
Well, yeah, I think even before you start considering open adoption, when you have a child and it looks that a termination could be imminent, some of these things to start really thinking about and see how that relationship with the family is, and what you can do to kind of, I think, sometimes build those bonds and look at what can I do to make this a better experience. Sometimes personally I love to read these these motivational stories about these success stories about adoptions and things, and there's been so many wonderful stories about adoptions and how the relationship with the biological family was maintained, and how wonderful it was for the children, and how wonderful it was for the adoptive family. And I think it made a big difference in the health of that biological family going forward too, because this is a traumatic time for them, and to think that they're working with somebody who loves their child, which I'm sure is quite important, but also can help them to maintain that. I think it could be devastating. Obviously it is devastating to lose your child. So it's a big thing, I think.
Laura, what I sometimes see more often than the biological parents coming back later on to try and open the adoption is actually the adoptive family coming back and opening the adoption. And so sometimes people do that through an investigator, through private sources, and say, here's a P.O. box, this is something confidential, please send pictures, letters, medical information, and things like that, and we'll send you pictures and update that. And so that's often, I think, a very good choice, because it does help the biological family sort of begin to process that maybe before a child goes through, goes on to maybe a search and reunion down the road. And so I oftentimes see that more than not, and also siblings being in contact through Facebook. Facebook is definitely where we're seeing a tremendous amount of search and reunion happening.
I've heard about that. So I know with social media, everybody's close by and they find each other. It's unbelievable. I haven't quite figured it all that much myself. I guess I'm too busy to do that. But it is it's become quite the avenue. And you're right. And every child is going to want to know, and they're going to ask these questions later on in their life, and they're going to want to, I think they're going to want to make those connections and say, you know, they want to understand the story and they want to meet their parents. And so I think it's a good thing if you bring them up with that knowledge and they don't feel like you were lying to them or hiding things from them as well.
Mm-hmm. I've done a lot of interviews with adults now, were adopted as younger children, and talking about why or why not they did a search and reunion. And so one of the three primary factors, whether they did a search and reunion or not, is they wanted to have pictures. Mm-hmm. They wanted to know, what did their biological parents look like or biological family look like? Is there somebody out there that looks like me? Mm-hmm. Two was they wanted to have medical information. I mean, that's one of the hardest things, mm-hmm. is going in. My daughter has heart disease, and when we went in, I was so thankful I had an open adoption, because I could call her birth mother and say, please check to see if anybody has any allergies to anesthesia. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, I want to know that going in. And we didn't have it. If we didn't have any medical information, that would be very difficult. So that's the second piece. And the third is to know their personality. So what were their interests? Did they really like and excel in sports, or were they artists or musicians, mm-hmm. or things like that? You know, sometimes with biological parents whose, you know, children are removed from them into the foster care system, they didn't themselves have an opportunity to explore the goodness in them. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes us sharing with our children that their biological parents had these sort of wonderful things that they knew or could do is a great connection for them.
It is, I think, and it makes them feel better about themselves, you know. So that's great. Is there any kind of recommendations that you'd like to give foster parents, you know, just in considering the whole process of open adoptions, like really some from your perspective, sure. You know, as an attorney who works with them, what would you tell them, you know, in starting this process?
Well, I would say I'm going to have two hats that I wear. As the attorney hat, I'm going to say, if you're my client and you're about to adopt, you need to be very clear with what you're signing on to. If you are going to agree to something, you need to be sure that you're going to fulfill on that agreement. Obviously, if things change, and that is in the statute, that you can go back and ask for a modification, sort of discontinue contact if there's, you know, bad things that sort of happen in the future. But, you know, you don't want to have to go down that road. So you need to be clear about what you're willing to do and not willing to do from the very beginning. For your child's benefit, formalizing that agreement really is a great opportunity too, to make sure everybody involved, whoever that agreement is with, is also honoring that agreement. From, you know, my other hat as sort of a parent or, you know, / counselor, social worker, was you really need to identify first what your intentions are here and look through your child's eyes and see what you hope for them in the future in terms of completing their quest about who they are and their own self-identity. And that, you know, some children who are adopted have a real deep yearning for knowing everything as far back as, I want to know my great-great-great-great-great-grandparents and where did they come from and so on and so forth. And some just want to know medical information. We don't know that in advance. And our children don't oftentimes choose adoption. Some do choose adoption if they're older, right? But some don't choose adoption. So it's our responsibility to help that door be at least somewhat open so you can access that information. But think of it as a lifelong relationship.
It's good. That's very good information and a lot to think about. I couldn't agree with you more. You're making me think of my own personal adoption. They told me I couldn't do an open adoption when I adopted my son because they didn't have those formal agreements, but we did an informal agreement. But I just know how it's been for my son just so important for me to explain. And he does ask a lot of questions about his other family. And you do look down the road towards them thinking, you know, what did I pick up from them? And so I think it just is, it's a good thing. And I hope that everybody out there is thinking about how, you know, it's all about the children's best interests. And I think when you think about this and you look down the road and where your child's going to go, I definitely think it's good for them, and it's good for us, and it's good for the families, and to maintain those family connections. So I just want to thank you, foster parents out there that are working with the biological families, because me personally, I just see this open adoption. as an extension of the co-parenting that we're already doing with the families, and if for whatever reason they can't reunify, that the next step would be, moving forward with an adoption and having some kind of continued contact. I just can't see adopting them and then cutting off contact. It just wouldn't seem like a natural thing, and I just can't see, how that would be in the best interests of the child. But I know, like you said, Maria, that there is some cases and you have to work through some of these details and maybe issues that come up, but I think that hopefully everybody with the best interests of that child in mind can work through some of those issues. So with that, we're about out of time. So just any other ideas, parting comments you'd like to share with our viewers?
Sure. Well, just remember that no matter what you're told, that you are allowed to do an open adoption, that it is in the statute, as Laura referred to earlier. It's going to be on their website, the link. You are allowed to do that. And so when you are ready to finalize your adoption, contact your attorney, have your attorney draw up a possible agreement, ask them about what kind of order can we put in place and for what purposes, siblings, grandparents, relatives, biological families, and what that would look like. If your attorney's not willing to sit down and talk that through with you, then it's time to choose another attorney. But it's possible and it can be done, and I always think memorializing that in something written from the very beginning so everybody's on the same page is the right thing to do.
I couldn't agree with you more. Well, thank you so much, Maria. It was a wonderful discussion about this very, very important topic. So I'm so thrilled you were able to join us today.
Thank you.
And with that, I want to remind everybody that we are always open to hear from you. We want your topic suggestions, your comments, your compliments. We love to hear it all. So just don't forget to contact us on our Facebook page, or you can, of course, email us here at QPI. And thanks again. We'll see you next time.